All right, so now we are recording. All right, in the global trends assignment and in our work up to that point, what I was trying to get you to think about a little bit was what kinds of things do people study in international studies? What are the studies in international studies? And you generally are looking at those things that we talked about. You know, you're looking at industrialization. Maybe you're international studies major, but an econ minor, or you're double majoring in econ. So you're really interested in trends like industrialization and economic globalization and deindustrialization, and you want to emphasize those. But maybe you're not. Maybe you're an aspiring cultural anthropologist, or an aspiring historian or something like that. Now, those same things may not be of interest to you, okay? But maybe secularization is, or maybe you're looking at globalization, but you're looking at it culturally. You're looking at the global spread of popular culture or something like that. There can be a lot of different ways to do things. The only common denominator being that whatever you're looking at can't be restricted by the borders, the territorial boundaries of any one nation state, okay? So that's why we were looking at those 5 trends. We could have picked others. I thought, though, that among those 5 combined, we kind of cover everything of interest that's going on in the world. So, that's why I picked those 5 organized in that way. What we're going to be looking at now are some of the concepts that people across different disciplines use in order to explore those kinds of trends, okay? And so we're going to start with this kind of problematic concept of culture. And it is one of those terms that everyone thinks they understand until someone asks them to define it. And then what you find out is that in a room of 10 people, you might have 5 or 6 or 7 different definitions. And they might appear in some ways to be incompatible. So we have to kind of be careful about that. Now, that link on the Moodle page is intended just to give you a conceptual flyover. These are the kinds of things that people in various disciplines have thought about when they've developed or identified or studied this concept of culture. And there are really these 3 types that they talk about. And one of them is culture as sort of social production, but it's generally looked at as kind of the apex of social production. What's the highest form of social expression that you have, whether it's in music or architecture or other, the fine arts, whatever. That's high culture, and that's what people in some disciplines have considered to be culture. That notion of culture was particularly prominent prior to the 20th century, and the real growing sophistication, among other things, of archaeology and anthropology, okay? Contrasting that would be also, within that same context, what people would consider to be sort of folk culture. It's referred to there as folk ways, or low culture, right? If you think about like folk music, things that are very localized, usually not terribly sophisticated, but often subtly nuanced in a way that makes them peculiar to a region or an ethnicity or something like that. That would be folk culture, or sometimes called low culture. At its best, not considered pejorative, meaning low in the sense that it's actually produced on the, at the grassroots level by people, as opposed to being embodied in a culture of universities or the conservatory or that rarefied atmosphere, of what purports to be genius, okay? Obviously, there are some problems with that kind of definition. By that definition, most of us would not be possessed of culture, okay? And so then it leaves blank this idea of, well, what do we have? And the old response used to be, you have high culture. You have to look up and find it. You have to aspire to it. It is there to inspire you. If you think about, for example, the apparent ironic paradox of having an impoverished people every worship day, let's say every Sunday, going to a big, beautiful, elaborate, or gaudy, cathedral or something in order to worship. A lot of people see that as a contradiction. What they don't understand is the historic purpose of that was the historical purpose of that, I'm sorry, was to inspire people. That is, you know, yes, you live these hard, wretched, mundane lives, and a lot of what's in your life might not be very pleasant and it might not be very beautiful, but you know, we can elevate your spirit to transcend that material, mundane ugliness and triviality and everything, and we can have this sort of celestial, beautiful, high cultural environment that you can visit for a couple of hours every Sunday, and you can, you know, you can kind of tap into the higher things, the nobler things, the finer things, the things that are closer to heaven, whatever it was. That was the purpose of that, was that it was embodying this kind of celestial beauty that compelled you to look up at those things beyond you rather than simply look down at the ground in your own world, to get you out of that, to help you escape from it, transcend it, not be bound by it spiritually if you were bound by it materially, okay? So you had, you know, this kind of tension between high and low culture for most of settled human history that arguably still exists. Now, one of the things that, again, I'm going to also augment the reading with other things for you to think about. Those old notions of culture are essentially pre-industrial, okay? And it begs the question, what happens when you have innovations in technology and breakthroughs in mass production, right, in manufacturing, that allow you to capture and reproduce at a much wider level the kinds of things that used to be rarefied, that very few people might ever hear or see or read or whatever. That is, you know, the first obvious example of that would be, you know, movable type printing, you know, which begins essentially in the 16th century. Because then you have, all of a sudden, a much more generalizable access to things that are written down. You're not limited merely by those few copies of a book that might be available because, you know, some monk in some monastery somewhere, you know, wrote it out by hand and illuminated it with gold foil and all these kinds of things, and then they kept it stored in the church. If you can mass produce those things, all of a sudden, you're sort of transmitting those ideas to a generalizable population. There's an incentive there, and also the capacity to increase literacy. What I'm trying to suggest is this is another example of how innovations in technology can affect culture. In this case, the transmission of what we used to call high culture, those things that were so rarefied that we had to write them down. Or what happens if part of high culture would be, you know, orchestral music, right? Or even could be chamber music as well, you know, smaller ensembles and things like that, where you go to a place, and in that place, in that moment, this beautiful music is performed by these brilliant musicians, and this eccentric but genius, you know, composer is sort of giving his own little flavor to it, because it was almost all men then. What happens if instead of that, you develop the ability of someone to go in and set up an apparatus and make a recording of that can be repeated over and over and over again, and in fact can be relatively inexpensively mass produced and disseminated to a lot of people. So some people would say, well, that's really great because you're making high aspirational, high culture available to us, the great unwashed, right? But other people would say, no, that was really the beginning of the end, because what it led to was the increasing commodification of culture. Okay, if you read some of the work of a, you know, intellectual by the name of Theodor Adorno, part of the Frankfurt School, and he wrote with his book with Horkheimer, for example, where he talks about the culture industry. This is a model that was developed. It was developed during the war, but it began to be pursued in publication right after the Second World War. And the idea there was, in those discussions, what Adorno and Horkheimer were talking about in terms of culture were these embodiments of values that were expressed in material ways, essentially. If you think of music, think of that as a material expression of an idea, right? Now, that idea can be very celestial, very divine, very rarefied and esoteric and mysterious, or it can be very mundane, very common. But still, very close to the heart because of its familiarity. So you have naturally high and low culture. What they said, though, was that as we developed industrial capacity, what we created was a kind of what they called middle brow culture. It was this kind of dilution of high culture and maybe false elevation of low culture, so that we had this thing that ultimately we would call pop culture or popular culture. What they referred to it as was a culture industry. That is, applying the techniques of industrial production, okay, to the generation of culture, so that increasingly people's experience of culture would be something that was neither something that they had created organically as sort of folk or low culture, nor would it be that esoteric, rarefied expression of celestial brilliance that only a few are capable of in any given generation. Instead, it would just be stuff that could be cranked out like, piston rods for an engine. Not unique, not particularly distinguished by anything other than the fact that it was catchy, it was fun, it was kind of trivial and not terribly deep. Has anybody ever heard, maybe in another class, this notion of the culture industry, or anything akin to that in any of the other disciplines? The reason I bring it up is, again, trying to help you see where a multidisciplinary, or I prefer interdisciplinary major like international studies, functions because of the capacity of the student and scholar to integrate the methodology of more than one discipline, okay? And so in this case, you've got history, you've got some sense of, industrial technology. You might need to understand some of the material production of industrialization. So you might need some economics. You might need to apply those to culture. So you might want to have some anthropology. You might want to do it across a vast stretch of time that predates written history. So there might be some archaeology, whatever it is. When we look at these cultures, try to look at these as an attempt to inspire interdisciplinary study, which is presumably what those of you who are IS majors will do. And think of it this way. If you think of something as encompassing multiple disciplines, what that really means is, yeah, there's a little bit of history and there's a little bit of, there's a little bit of culture and stuff like that. Okay, and that's fine. That's perfectly useful. That often is what happens when you major in something and then you minor in something. There may not be an obvious connection between those things. Okay. And unfortunately, that's far too often the case when people are choosing minors. It's sort of like, well, you go to the buffet and there's something you're really hungry for, and that's your major, but you're not quite full. So then you add to that something that you think is going to, like a dessert or something in practical terms will make you more marketable when you get out into the job market or something, and you choose a minor. Okay. What international studies is what's called, generally properly, understood, is an interdisciplinary program, where, yeah, you're choosing from the buffet, but you're putting together an integrated kind of ensemble of all of these different disciplinary techniques and methods and things in order to have a coherent single meal. That is, okay, this is my worldview. And I've applied to that, integrating, right, together history and maybe political science, or international relations, or econ, or anthropology, or whatever. Okay. What definitions like culture serve to do is remind us how those things have developed as sort of multidisciplinary. The disciplines haven't always been talking to each other, and so they generate these conceptual definitions that often don't seem very compatible. It's almost always because either there's a big distance of time between them, or more commonly now, because you've got disciplines that don't talk to each other and they're sort of talking past each other. Okay. So this notion of high culture, or something like that. Well, there's high culture and there's low culture, and high culture obviously is better. Okay, low culture is common, and that's very nice, and we can pat it on its little head. But high culture is something we kind of worship, even in a secular way. Because we know that this expression of ideas and the people who generate it, that rare cohort of individuals who can actually produce that stuff, they're special. Okay. The United States historically has very little regard for high culture. Um, Part of it is we've always had this subtext of egalitarianism to a certain extent that's informed the architecture of the republic, and certainly the way that we inhabit the republic. The idea that, well, nobody's better than I am. Either everyone's equal or at least everyone's just as good as everyone else, whatever that means. Okay. That sort of militates against having a society that really values high culture, you know, while simultaneously perhaps wanting to preserve low culture. The United States is probably the largest producer and consumer of what Adorno would call that middlebrow culture industry product. That is where we've commodified. This is music. How do you know? Because record producers say so, record labels say so. Musicians have to produce what's marketable. In other words, hip hop is no longer an organic, low culture artifact of authentic street expression. It's just a product. Okay. This theory would say it's just a product. Classical music now isn't really classical because classical music stopped being produced, sometime around the end of the 19th century. But it doesn't really matter because if it has orchestral instruments in it and we don't quite understand it at first listening, it must be brilliant. Therefore, it's high culture. Well, a lot of that is either an embodiment of the culture industry and the commodification of the expression of values or something, or it's just a reaction against it. When you think of the tradition of the avant-garde in the 20th century, a lot of that was pushing against this kind of commodification and trivialization of large ideas and things. Part of it was maybe there was nowhere else to go. How many more symphonies can you write, that don't just rip off, the last of the classical composers. But part of it was a desire to continue to push the boundaries of high culture, that is, of aspirational, exploratory, visionary culture, as opposed to stuff that was easy to understand and easy to market. Okay, so the reason, again, why I point this out is the concept of culture is affected by technology, by the mass production of things in one way or another. The second kind of culture that's mentioned in that link, okay, is this continuum of culture, not from high to low culture in the sense of going from folk ways to whatever, the genius level of celestial production is, but from savagery to civilization. Okay, and that's largely an early anthropological assumption. People would say they observe these, these various people in various places in the world and the way they lived, and they extrapolate from that. So, okay, this is their culture. And this would be along the continuum from savagery to civilization. We'd put them here. They're essentially, the nice word used to be pristine. A pristine culture was essentially a nice way of saying savages. Okay. Now,
I have a quick question.
Yeah, I was just going to ask if anybody had any questions.
For like in the 21st century, when you have like pop culture celebrities that, have different cultures than, what we would say a normal person may have, what would that type of culture be then?
You'd have to give me an example of that, Micah.
Kardashians, I guess.
How do they have a different culture?
Just way of life, just day-to-day stuff.
What do you mean? What is different about their way of life?
I mean, they have cameras around them all the time. They have
So do all of you. You guys are always taking selfies of yourself. Are you kidding?
They're being filmed. They're being filmed and like put onto television for other people's entertainment because it's different having cameras.
They're performers. Yeah, it's not real. It's a performance. In other words, a performance is an embodiment of a certain kind of value, okay? But that doesn't mean that they have their own culture. Their culture is the culture industry. They are products of the culture industry. That's not a unique culture.
No, I'm not.
If you're an actor in film, okay, you don't live in a unique culture in the sense that I've been talking about so far, right? It depends on where your culture is, where you live and the things you value and how those are expressed. The Kardashians are not immune from that. It's just that what you're seeing as the Kardashians isn't real. It's performance, okay? In the same way that someone in a TV sitcom is performing, they are that is performance. It's not really the way they really live. You don't really hear them when the cameras are off, you know. And there's no,
I
you know,
think
by the way, that's not original with the Kardashians. This idea of dropping cameras into people's homes and things like that actually began at least as far back as the late 60s. There was a documentary done on this family, the perfect last name, they were the Loud family, right? Their name was Loud. And they agreed to have a bunch of people come in almost anthropologically and set up cameras and film them day to day, right? But that didn't put them in a different culture, right?
I think he means like the culture created by the Kardashians.
They
Like,
haven't created a culture, is what I'm saying. They haven't.
They actually have created a special kind of culture because it's different from what you're talking about of like, oh, hey, here's a family. Let's see what they're like when you record them. These are people who have their entire lives been raised of this premise of the cameras always rolling. It's similar to, you'll see these people on YouTube. It's the family channels. These people who, from the second their kids are born, they're constantly recording and putting it online. It's a different kind of culture because there's different expectations, how they look at things, how they process things.
Are they?
How-
But wait,
how- how they
Zachary,
learn things.
wait. See, this is the thing. All right, we think we know what it means until we start trying to define it. I'm not saying that their lifestyle isn't peculiar. It isn't unique, but it isn't peculiar, and they didn't create it. It was created for them and with them in mind. Okay, but beyond that, do they really, really honestly articulate and express unique values that Americans had never thought about before? I'm going to suggest that no, they don't, and here's why. They wouldn't be marketable if everything they did was unique and new. It isn't, because we know, one of the things we know about pop culture, about the culture industry, if we want to use that model, it's premised on things that are easy to understand. If they're not easy to understand, they fail. I don't think there's anything about the Kardashians that's hard to understand. Now, is it absurd? Is it without value? Maybe. But is it hard to understand? No. They're radical materialists, like most Americans aspire to be, right? They're trivial in their absolutely vacant lack of knowledge about much of anything, like many Americans. They reflect, I would argue, they reflect working to middle class America, but they do it from the vantage point of extraordinarily affluent, privileged performers. Okay, so in that sense, it's a peculiar iteration of performance that for the most part we really haven't seen before. It's more self-aware and self-conscious, perhaps, but the values aren't new. I would really, I mean, think hard on this. Think about a fundamental value that is new with the Kardashians, that is now widely accepted, that people follow, that they never would have followed before. That's culture.
What about like didn't Kylie Jenner like create the whole thing, like the lips, or I don't know who it was, but there was one of the girls that made big lips like a big thing.
No,
Yeah,
Besides-
they made those cultural challenges.
no, that's
I would also-
centuries old. That is centuries old. That is not new. No, really, honestly, it's not new. But you see what I'm saying? In
I would
other words,
also-
hold on. If you know that history, and some of you do, okay, it's more than challenge too. Okay, but that's depending on what Carly means by challenge. What I'm suggesting is this: they don't embody anything that hasn't been more or less the bedrock of popular societies, in many cases for centuries. Why do you think women started putting things on their lips? To enhance the way they look, but also to try to get them to swell up because it looked more alluring. That is centuries old. Why did they put things in their eyes, like belladonna, that were poisonous in order to make their eyes look alluring? That's centuries old. So none of that's new. None of that's new. None of the, I mean, yeah, maybe they've had more surgery than the average person to augment what they've done, but that notion of physical augmentation is centuries old. Centuries old. So that's what I mean by, a new culture, for example, think about a new culture as this. If, for example, I can give you, I think a good example of that would be if you look at a place, there's a neighborhood in Miami-Dade County called Little Haiti, okay? And it is obviously, as the name would imply, a lot of immigrants from the island of Haiti, or shared with, Dominican Republic, right? There is an instantly recognizable patois in terms of a kind of colloquial speech that is a combination of sort of French and what's sometimes in other cultures called pidgin, all right? Not pejoratively, by the way, okay? That is instantly recognizable. They can understand each other. There's a peculiar orientation to Catholicism that often includes things like Santeria, okay? Those things are peculiar for America, and they are unique to many Americans who've never seen them. That unique doesn't just mean different, it means unprecedented. There's no such thing as something being a little unique or very unique. Unique is a status in itself. That is, it's the only one, okay? There's no other culture in the United States that is identical to that. There are other cultures like that. That's where you sometimes get the concept of what's called a subculture, okay? You could argue that hip hop, for example, in its origins, if you go back to the 80s in hip hop, was an emerging subculture. But also there were subcultures within hip hop, right? If you went to East LA, you would hear a certain kind of rap. If you went nearby to Compton, it sounded different. If you went across the country, it sounded different. Those could be subcultures, but there was a shared language, a shared orientation to the world, a shared worldview that was peculiar, if not unique, to people who were in and around, early rap and hip hop at that. Well, it wasn't then called hip hop, right? But the Kardashians really haven't done anything like that. Because for one thing, what have they really produced? Culture produces things. That's one of the ways that we know it exists, because of what it produces. We were already rampant consumers, spending far beyond our means. We were already obsessed with our corrupt reflection in every mirror we could find. That's not new. We were already obsessed with what money could buy rather than what work could reveal about our character. That's not new. So that's what I mean when I say culture. Now, they are an artifact of culture. That is, I think, maybe the better way to explain. What I'm trying to do is tie what you're saying into these definitions of culture so that we have a way that we can have a general understanding of it rather than you being able to say, well, that's not what I mean by culture. Okay, if one of you can say, no, I mean something different than you on culture, then we have nothing to talk about. That's the challenge of this kind of discussion is, can we have some agreed upon terms? What I'm trying to suggest by invoking culture here is, it's really hard to do. But one of the ways you have to do it is you have to discipline your thinking. Because something is new to you is no evidence at all that it's new or that it's unique. Okay, that's what I'm suggesting. All right. Now, it also, by the way, has nothing to do with this discussion of this sort of illusory notion of sort of savagery, civilization, things like that. Can you see, though, where in that continuum of culture, right, there's this sense of, well, we can look at them and we can look at their culture, right? But it's savage. What would a savage culture be? From that vantage point, what would be meant by savagery? It's not necessarily, oh, they're mean. That's not necessarily what it means. But what do you think that would mean? It's an anthropological concept with some faulty archaeology, implied in it. But what would be a savage culture?
Moguls. Moguls.
How?
Well, they were about the most savage culture there ever was.
Do you really
As
mean
far
that, or
as
do you mean the Mongols?
Mongols, yeah.
Well, savage in what way?
Oh, they were brutal and bloodthirsty.
But again, I didn't say that's what it meant. It doesn't mean they're mean.
Okay.
Yeah,
But
so
they
that's
also were kind of nomadic too, and
well, not every savage culture is nomadic.
is
There
nomadic.
were cultures that had established villages and things like that that were part of that, you know, that part of the spectrum that would be classified as savage. Okay. And again, if they might not be conspicuously warlike or brutal or anything else, but the idea is there's something that distinguishes them from civilized. And there was a sort of
Matter
middle
of
ground, right?
Isn't it just a matter of perspective from an outside culture of groups that don't really fit into their ideas of what is quote unquote civilized? Because my family comes from Norway, you know, the quote unquote Vikings. I use that term briefly, and we were called savages. We were called animals, but we still had culture. We still had rules. We had laws. We had families.
Oh no, wait. No one's saying that a savage culture doesn't have values and doesn't have culture. What we're trying to determine is how would someone make a distinction and say, well, these cultures are sort of more savage, these are more civilized. What would the meaningful distinction be? Assuming for a second that it wasn't purely value laden and subjective, that there was an attempt at least to give it some valence, some meaning, some significance. Because I don't think it's accurate historically to say that every culture is the same, first of all. I also don't think that it's terribly accurate to say that every culture embodies the same values. And I also don't think that it's historically accurate to say that every culture's values are capable of producing the same outcomes. So the question is, what is savage? I'm not saying that it's a relevant concept today, but in other words, we gain nothing if we just decide that everyone who ever articulated an idea with which we now disagree was an animal or was creepy or was, you know, just subjective and racist and all that. There's got to be more to it than that. And of course there is. It's too easy for us to just dismiss people and say, well, you know, like Woodrow Wilson was a segregationist. Therefore, there's nothing that he could ever have done that could have had any value. In the case of Woodrow Wilson, I'm tempted to agree with you, but, you know, it's not historically, it's not meaningful. And so just to say, well, people said that the Vikings were savage, but they had culture. The Vikings were savage from the vantage point of people who had defined something called civilization. They would be.
What I was trying to make was.
Go ahead.
That was the point I was trying to make. Was it's a matter of perspective to a given culture, to an outside culture. It's a label they give to someone who isn't them.
No, I don't think that's accurate because the Vikings didn't go around calling other people civilized.
They didn't, because what I'm talking about is the outside perspectives were labeling us savage because of their own perspective. There were people that we call savage, but they were enemies in combat, people who fell outside of our social ideas. It was all a matter of perspective given on the culture.
Well, let's see if we can go a little bit beyond that. Okay, in other words, think about the things that we've talked about as global trends and see if we can't situate, however illusory, this distinction in that. In other words, would you say that it would make more sense to think of a pre-industrial society as distinct from an industrialized society? Forget values. Just do you think, are they likely to produce different cultures? That should be pretty easy. What do you think? In other words, a society whose existing value system doesn't compel them to industrialize. Wouldn't that be a different kind of society than a society whose prevailing values compelled them to industrialize because of what they valued? Because, you know, the thing about human beings is we very seldom pursue something if we don't value it. Why would we? Does that make sense what I'm saying? In other words, if you don't value convenience, you're not going to keep trying to change things technologically to make things easier. You're just going to, you find something, it works for you, and you stay there. It's one of the reasons why, like, your parents or your grandparents often, can't work a cell phone or something, because it's not important to them. They don't care, now that they've completely taken over Facebook. Now they've controlled the world, But it is much more than just some condescending, subjective appraisal of people who think themselves to be superior. There is more to it than that. There really is. So what we have to ask ourselves is, if we did away with the word savage, okay, because that's become such a pejorative, can we really say that there aren't meaningful distinctions we can make between a pre-industrial and an industrialized society? That's not a rhetorical question. Because some of you, it almost sounds like you're implying, no, there really is no difference. Or if there is a difference, it's just the difference that's made up by somebody looking from the outside. For one thing, you're leaving aside, okay, that's what human beings do. Everything we do is observed from the outside. That's what anthropology is. It's observation from the outside. They can talk all they want about being participant observers, right? They're observing from the outside. And yet we know that we have acquired an extraordinary amount of understanding about other cultures and other societies because of the people who've gone out and done that field work. Never mind how flawed it is methodologically, okay? But you can't just say in a uniform way that it's all just condescending and subjective. That doesn't make any sense. It would be the same thing as saying there's no value in science because it doesn't respect God. It doesn't make any sense. So I'll ask you again, are there differences that we might assume, or we might observe, more importantly, forget our values, between a society that is pre-industrial and one that is industrialized? It's a fairly simple question. Nobody's asking whether one's better than the other. I got to say, I kind of find this astonishing.
I say yes, that there's a difference.
Well, presumably there's not just a difference, but there would be things that we could observe in one society that we wouldn't probably expect to find in the other kind of society. There's nothing in that that's intrinsically biased, for example, or flawed. I mean, observation is what it is. It's, you're going and you're looking. Now, if it's systematic observation, you have ways of disciplining the way you observe so that you try to filter out as much as can be done your personal biases. For one thing, we know that people who go out and do anthropological field work, they don't get very far if they're blatant racists. Their work just isn't accepted anymore. Now, there might have been a time in the 19th century when it was dominated by people who were fairly blatant racists, but that was then and this is now. And there are a lot of professors of anthropology here who are going to struggle with the idea that, there's something wrong about saying this society can be viewed as distinct from this one. Here's how. Not distinct, but not better than or worse than. We have to think about this because when you look globally, you're going to see more that is different in many ways than what is similar, especially at first glance. Now, the longer you look and the more time you spend in places other than your home, the less those differences matter. They're still there, they just don't matter. What a lot of people don't realize is that's the extent to which you've reached farther into that culture. You fused it with your own. Okay, that happens a lot. It happens a lot. Okay, so this notion, though, of that was a way of doing things. Now, the more recent studies have done what I think Zachary was suggesting we should do, which is, can we take that observational structure but strip it of its bigotry and its overt bias and its condescension and all those things that have no scientific validity and that really don't help understanding? They just reinforce a sense of superiority. Okay, can you do that? Cultural anthropology would say, yeah, you can. And we've been doing it now for the better part of, I would say the better part of probably half a century or more. Let's say 70 years, 60, 70 years. Okay. And so what do you have to do? What do you try to observe if you want to make sense of culture? This hasn't come up yet. Have we defined culture yet? We've talked about different ways of thinking about it, but have we yet really defined culture? I've sort of thrown some things out there. Okay. So you tell me, what's culture? Not what are the different kinds of cultures, but what I've sort of led you to this place and then to say, oh, but you know, we haven't defined culture yet.
I think culture is a combination of a central, like, established set of customs and norms that people live by in a civilization, I guess, and that's how they live by. That's what I think.
What do you, when you say central, what do you mean?
Central, as in like everybody, I want to say, has like the same expectations of how to live by.
Well,
not
okay.
to have like the same social or like norms and customs and all that, and that's just what everybody knows in that civilization.
Well, let's use the United States as an example. If the United States is a single agreed upon set of norms and notions of how to live well, or what the right way to live is, do we have that in the United States? Kennedy refuses to speak, but emphatically shakes her head, by the way, for those of you listening. That's what she's doing. But no, okay. So all right, we've got one vote for no. The United States doesn't have that. Will we then say, either, Nanika, you're wrong, or, you know what, Nanika, you've just helped us understand something. Americans have no culture. My God. We are cultureless. Are we cultureless? Do we have no culture?
No, we do. We do.
Okay, but again, what are the things that we all agree on because they're centralized?
Going to school.
Really? Then why do about 7 out of 10 American adults not have a college degree of 4 years or more? That's school.
Well, also part of going to school is getting a job, and that's something else that we live by, is like you get it.
So you're saying that the belief in getting a job is uniquely American?
No, it's
In
not.
other words, we know an American when we see an American because they're always trying to get a job. The French never do that. But we know the Americans do.
I'm just thinking, yeah.
By the way, there is something to that. This was way before any of you were born, but back when we used to talk about yuppies in the 80s, the French had this cohort of people who were like the French version of yuppies. Guess what they aspired to? Never to work. That was their idea. That they were so sophisticated that they would never work. You know, that they would just be affluent. I mean, the French, right? There's something going on there that we just don't understand here. Okay, so do we have common agreed upon values in the United States that everyone shares? Because that was the original assumption that, and I think it is for most people, that a culture is something that everyone shares. Everyone is a part. Do we have that? What are the values that thereby identify and define us as American? Not because they may be unique to us, but because in terms of their intensity or the way they're embodied or the way they're pursued, they're peculiar to us. We do it in a way that's manifestly American. How do we know what an American is? How do we know? Can we look and say, oh, that's an American?
Language.
Okay, that's right. It's one of the things we haven't even included yet. We do not speak English. We speak American. The English tell us this all the time. What have you done to our language? We've made it our own, thank you very much. And you know what? When you hear us, you know. I guarantee you, I have been on way too many Zoom calls over the last several months, including with Brits, and they know right away who the American in the virtual room is. All right. Well, they know because I swear differently and better. by the way. But also, they hear that kind of twangy, weird, what are you doing to your vowels accent, and they know right away, that's American. Yes, oh God, we have to listen to him now. It's preposterous. What have you done to our language, you animal? I'll bet you want a job. You know, that kind of thing. All right, so language is part of that. You're right. That's important. In other words, language is a vehicle for the expression of our values. And the fact that, you know, we use language in a certain way is something we recognize as American. But do all Americans use language the same way?
No. But do boundaries have anything to do with it?
Well, when you say, okay, when you say boundaries, though, what kinds of, there are lots of different kinds of boundaries.
Like geographical boundaries, like the Cajuns speak very differently than, you know, maybe.
And anybody.
Than anybody.
Yeah, I mean, come on. There's another instantly recognizable accent. It's like, oh, was that tape played backwards? No, that's a Cajun, man. That's just the way that guy talks. It's just cool, you know. I mean, it's intrinsically cool and slightly frightening.
Yeah.
Well, it's part of culture. In other words, again, I would suggest generally, the general thing that Nanako was talking about is the English language made American. We all speak some variation of that. Because if we don't, we can't do the other things we need to do. I mean, we can't get a job and we can't get an education and we can't do the other things unless we have functional mastery of that language. We can't do it. So we all have an agreed upon language. And that's one of the things that characterizes us as an English speaking culture. However, as Patricia pointed out, we don't all speak English the same way, or American or whatever it is the same way. And you don't even have to go to so rarefied and esoteric a subculture as Cajun. What are the other fairly easily recognizable distinctions of the use and sound of language?
There's like the or like East Coast accent compared to.
Well, there ain't just one.
There are multiple, yes, multiple.
But how are they different?
Dialect.
Austin.
They're not, that technically wouldn't be, a linguist would not call that a dialect.
Well, no, but I am saying that dialects are included.
Oh, I'm sorry,
within,
Shelby, I beg your pardon.
in general.
You're already jumping ahead of us. We'll get to that in a second. But,
Okay.
well, in other
I
words,
just
Cajun
covered
is more-
linguistic
Cajun would be more
anthropology,
like-
so
Yeah,
yeah.
Cajun would be more like a dialect.
Yeah.
The little Haiti thing I was talking about, that's a dialect. Yeah. The difference between Mexican Spanish and Spanish is sometimes referred to as dialect. I don't think that's accurate, but sometimes it is. But it's, in other words, the inflections are distinct. Certain words are pronounced distinctly different. But for example, I know right away when I'm hearing somebody who's not just from the East Coast, they're from Boston. I know right away. No one sounds like that except people from Boston. What they do to vowels ought to be criminal from a Californian's vantage point, right? Is that Cassie? Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm from Montana. I don't know if this would count, but when I first moved here, the biggest thing that I would get made fun of was pronouncing vowels. So like at home, people say bag instead of bag, or like, you know, flag, like, oh, we got to raise the flag today, or grab me that rag or whatever.
Yeah.
And every time I go back and forth, I have to like in my brain be like, okay, it's bag, bag, bag versus bag, 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 so I don't stick out. And then I work at the Hawk and I can tell if people are from Montana or Wyoming. My little sister goes to school in Iowa, and I've even before seeing people's driver's license been able to be like, are you from like, you know, not
Yeah.
here?
Yeah, like, are you from not here?
You
I mean,
shouldn't
we all
have
do
to
that.
change
That's the
the way
first
that
thing
you
we do.
speak,
You're
though.
not from around here.
Yeah.
Wherever you're from, you're not from around here. Yeah, of course. Now, those would be accents. But that accent isn't just a nuance of speech. And that's an important difference, because often that accent is a kind of a window that invites us in to a really different way of living. That we might, yeah, okay, it's American in the sense that, you know, you still eat lousy food and you watch too much TV and you do all things that Americans do because they're patriotic, but you could have very different values. I mean, like if you go to a place like Minnesota, I've only been to Minnesota twice. I thought I was in Canada. I really did. first of all, most of the people I met were nice, and I don't find that to be the case with most Americans. They were just sort of friendly, but also, they had that way of talking, where they, oh gosh, they said gosh a lot, more than I'd ever heard since I was like 4. When you kind of had to say gosh around kids before an F-bomb became a comma and we became Irish, those we can use language for cues that tell us, like what Cassidy was saying, oh, I think I know where you're from. And it's not that idea of a bias or like, oh, you're inferior to me. It's like, I recognize that. Now I know something about you. I have an access to you as a person that I didn't have before because now I've heard you speak. Language is an important cultural cue as to what maybe where there might be either a subtle or a dramatic difference in values, so that Nanako's right. I mean, part of culture is shared values, but they're not all shared evenly everywhere, but they can still constitute a culture. I would suggest it this way. They're not so much centrally uniformly shared. They're the ones that prevail, which I think is, Nanako, I think that's what you meant. The prevailing, what are the prevailing values here? What are the prevailing things that are accepted or tolerated? That's how you come to know a people. But we can make that subtle when we start listening to language and, we think about geography and the way it associates with language and all that. We can start to draw assumptions. We have to be careful about it, but we can start to draw assumptions. We're taking in information and we're doing the one thing that human beings do better than anything ever created. We make patterns that help us recognize something. Now, sometimes those patterns are flawed, they're wrong, and we can end up with a distorted view of the world. That's sort of what Zachary was suggesting when he was saying, you think you know what you mean by savagery, but other people look at that and say, well, aren't you really dismissing them as being inferior? Because maybe the patterns aren't connecting right. They look right to you, but you've made some mistakes. Culture is difficult because of that, because it's a human construct, and every human construct is imperfect. That is, it's not created and then perfectly functioning. Not everybody speaks the language the same way. And because of that, we can learn something about people. What we have to be careful of is, have I learned something, or have I associated you with a subculture to which you might not in every other way belong? Okay, so you always have to be aware of the potential for bias in that. But what I'm suggesting is that as human beings, whether we're dealing with, a relatively big, diverse country like America, or whether we're traveling all over the world, we bring our assumptions of what those things sound like or what those things look like with us wherever we go. It does not make us bad. It doesn't even necessarily make us wrong. We just have to be aware of it, because we can't always impose those values on other people and expect to make sense. That's the purpose of a discipline like cultural anthropology. It's not so much to say, oh, every culture is special and we should celebrate them all. That's a kind of naive view of the world. It accepts that there are things that people of one culture might really despise about people of another culture because they don't understand them, or they're frightened by them, or whatever. But what it does is say that isn't a hierarchy. It's just difference. And it's so the modern breakthroughs in terms of a global trend, the modern breakthroughs in the concept of culture have been to divest the term of the pejorative sense of better, worse, right, wrong, and instead to accept a multiplicity of cultures, a multiplicity of social systems, a multiplicity of values. Okay? That's been a relatively recent development for human beings in terms of its sophistication. So when you're looking through that reading on culture, that's what I want you to keep in mind. I want you to see, how does that term, that concept as you read about it, how does it bounce off of your own brain? What does it do to inform how you apply the term culture? Okay. For example, could we say accurately? Yeah, we're almost at that time. Could we say accurately? Well, there is this thing in America. Okay, and you'll hear this all the time. People will talk about the African American community, or the Asian American community, or the Latinx community. Does that exist? because we use those terms a lot. Do they really tell us anything? Is there really a singular African-American community in the United States that could be, for example, integrated by an understanding of, yeah, there's a shared culture and pretty much everybody is in that culture as distinct from white America? What I'm trying to get you to think about, these are terms most of you use. Do you ever stop to think about what they mean? See, that's one of the challenges of a discipline like this, is that because you're interdisciplinary, you want your understanding of one discipline to inform your understanding of another discipline. In other words, you want constantly to be sort of your own best skeptic. Am I using terms that really have value, or do I need to refine them? Am I really saying the thing I mean? In what I say, am I really reflecting what I'm thinking? Well, you're not if you don't have a clear idea in your head of what the concepts mean that you're using. And if you don't have a clear idea of that, it's really difficult, arguably close to impossible, to transmit your thinking to someone else, because they might have yet another notion of what those concepts mean. This is why communication is so difficult, and why one of the components of international studies is communication, both in terms of a spoken language and in terms of other symbolic articulations of ideas. Language transmits values. Language transmits meaningful content, but it's not always received in the way that it was intended at transmission. One of the obstacles to that is culture. And so we find ourselves again and again and again and again making these assumptions. Well, these people are different from these people. Well, what does that mean? And then that's the question we often don't ask. I have an assumption that these people over here are different from these people. Yeah, and so what does that mean? Different how? And that's where most of you get really quiet, because you are products of an educational system that's at a real crossroads in terms of struggling with identity. And a real key notion to culture is identity. Your identity is governed by culture in the sense that it's guided and shaped and molded by the culture within which you are embedded. You will speak a certain way. You will value certain things. You will not value other things. You will tolerate some things. You will not tolerate other things. That's not you as an individual. That's you as somebody inhabiting a culture. And indeed, it gets us to the point where the concept of individual becomes problematic. Culture is hard enough to understand. What's an individual? Tell me what an individual is. As distinct from a culture, what's an individual? And why do some societies not care what the answer to that question is, where others think that it's central to an understanding of who they are? The United States is more focused on individuals than any other society on the planet, in terms of what it purports to value as a culture, in terms of the way we structure, the things that we do. Some people refer to us as hyper individualistic. The whole thing about wearing masks, the common rejection of that is not based on science or health. I have an individual right. This is my individual freedom. In most of the rest of the world, you're still going to find that, but you're going to find a lot of other people who think that's the most absurd idea in the world, because what it implies is, I as an individual have a right to put you at risk. What society tolerates that? Do you see where I'm going with this? Right? This notion of an individual is really problematic. It's problematic in part because you have constantly to counterbalance it against this enveloping notion of a culture that's something like what Nanako described as, it may not be central, it may not be that everyone values these things, but you're absolutely not wrong. In other words, what are the kind of predicates of agreed upon value? Some people might be more passionate or less passionate about it. Some people might argue about the best way to articulate it, but the values are there. They are there. It's hard to find very many people anymore who really think that the right way to live is to be a violent bigot. You're always going to find deviance in any cohort, but it's just not a prevailing value. So the challenge is, why is it still there? Is it a product of individualism? Or is it a vestige of an older culture that has not been deinstitutionalized, where we haven't deconstructed the behaviors and the assumptions that perpetuated that notion of, say, violent bigotry?
Like the United States, we still put violent bigotry up on a pedestal, but we just call it patriotism.
Well, no, we don't. We don't. Most of us don't. That's the thing, Zachary. There's a minority of Americans who do that, but most of us really don't do that. We really don't. Most of us are really appalled by that. I mean, we know, well, at least as far as we can tell, we know from, say, available survey data and things like that, that most Americans, for example, most Americans are not natural fighters. It is not popular for Americans who want to go out and conquer people. Most Americans don't value that.
But
And yet we know,
regularly topple governments.
what I'm saying again, I'm sorry.
Well, you said that we naturally don't want to do that, but the U.S. overthrows more democratically elected governments than any other country.
Historically inaccurate. No, not true. I mean, come on, man. We're competing with the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany. There've been a lot of big powers that have done that. But what I'm suggesting there, and this is the problematic nature of a centralized culture, is that you can have a prevailing culture among a people that isn't always reflected in its government. That might be the dilemma of the United States, that, we might have a kind of predator state that, that's dominated by people who have the wherewithal to control it, who want to go out and do these things and destabilize democracies or do whatever they want to do. But historically, the case is usually that most of America has to be kind of dragged into that, usually through relentless domestic propaganda. It's very seldom that what you find in Americans is, let's go out and kill them. Now, there's always going to be a cohort of people like that anywhere who are going to want to do that. And those people, in that sense, would be probably considered savage. But it's not a critical mass of America. It's not a majority of America. Okay. And it isn't really anywhere else, really. One of the things that we know that isn't often talked about, for example, is for all that Americans tend to be either ignorant of or terrified by the so-called Islamic world, as though we're all of a piece. Most places in the Islamic world have a relatively high regard for the American people. They kind of think we're cool. They kind of think we're fun. They do, but their governments don't. So, Zachary, I think that's what you're talking about. And that's a great point. It is a great point that we'll talk about later when we talk about nation states in the next, you're actually a module ahead of us, right? But when we talk about nation states, what we'd be talking about is the problematic challenge of taking this kind of cultural assumption and value structure that we're talking about and fusing that with the juridical boundaries of a territory that's controlled by a central state. And we'll see that can create certain kinds of problems. And that, I think, is kind of what Zachary's talking about. But that's getting a little ahead of us, and that's fine. I like the thinking. So what I'd like you to do is, as objectively as you can, take a look at that first reading. And again, it's fairly long. There's a lot to it. I don't want you to master the whole thing, but I do want you to give it a flyover and just skim it. Look at the headings. By the way, when you're doing this kind of stuff, just a hint to be going on with before I let you go. I learned it took me until graduate school to learn this. When I was in graduate school, typically we would have 3 seminars in a semester. Okay, each of those seminars would meet once a week, and each of those seminars, the reading requirement for each of those seminars was usually between 200 and 500 pages a week, okay? Because it was graduate school, all right? Nobody read all of that stuff. The professors hadn't read all that stuff. So you got to find ways to go through and give these things a kind of informed scan. Some of these things I tried to get, they give you help. They'll have like numbered headings, or they'll have diagrams or things like that. And so you give those numbered headings a flyover, and they have statements like culture influences biological processes. Well, that's pretty provocative. So get a sense of, well, what does that mean? Or if you don't know what it means, then make a note. And then when we're starting up in the next class, you can ask me, or you can shoot me an email. Hey, Bill, what does this mean? Is that page numbers? Yeah, on page 7, what do they mean when they say culture influences biological processes? I tried to read that, but it didn't make any sense to me. And the first thing I'm going to ask you is, did you really think about it? Okay. But yeah, don't just try to go to the beginning of these things and read all the way through them, because they will just ruin your day. They really will. It's no fun. But education need not be miserable. And so I'm just trying to ask you, with these readings, give them a fair look, all right? And maybe look at them more than once. And maybe the first time you look at them, just really skim them and just look at headings. And that'll create some questions in your head. Then fine, I'm done for today. I don't want to do that anymore. I have to binge watch TV now because I'm really into the culture industry. What are the Kardashians doing? And then you come back later on after you've recovered from your Kardashian binge, which might take a day. And then you look at it again. This time you stop on 1 or 2 of those headings. Get a better understanding of what the authors are talking about. Don't worry so much about whether or not you agree with it, right? Because no one cares. What everyone does care about when you're in academia is, do you understand it? Can you apply it to anything, right? Can you make use of it? But you won't know the answer to that till you understand it, okay? But again, it's not so much do you agree. That becomes much less important the farther you go in not only in your studies, but in your life. Really, it just, no one really cares. One of the nice things about living in what historically has been in many ways a surprisingly tolerant place to live is that you can have really strange ideas. And people are going to look at you sideways if you express those ideas. But we've kind of gone beyond the point where they're going to burn you at the stake for them. So it's because people don't care. If we cared, we'd burn you at the stake. If people really cared about what I was thinking, I think I would have been dead by the time I was about 12, But they don't. They really don't. Your parents don't care what you're thinking. As long as you're not thinking about it, doing anything stupid that's going to cost them time or money, they probably really don't care. And if they don't, they're probably good people, because what they've decided is, okay, you are now your own person. I'm here to help, but I'm not here to care about what you're thinking. That's up to you. Those are your ideas, not mine. Okay. I wouldn't worry about that too much. But particularly as a student, be much less concerned about whether or not you agree with or have to defend something. Because if you're defending a point of view in that moment, you're probably not learning very much, because you've kind of closed the doors to defend. Okay. The challenge has always been for me, can I explore a perspective and then inhabit that in my mind, right? Inhabit that for a while and see what it does to me to think like that. Do I learn anything from that vantage point? I can tell you, I always do. And another thing, I mentioned this before, I'll mention it one more time, then I'll let you go. As soon as you think you got something figured out, argue against it. Every time you think you've nailed it, think, okay, if I were going to argue against that, how would I do it? And you should be able to do that. Because there is nothing that we're going to talk about that any one of you, including me, has all figured out. There's always a flaw. There's always something you're missing. It's just, these things are too comprehensive. You don't have to worry about that. Okay, just don't try to fight for your own idea, because first of all, it isn't your own idea. Okay, it's something that you've been exposed to that's stuck. It might be useful, but it might not. But then ask yourself, okay, can I learn something from what I'm being presented? Okay, are there any questions? I did way too much talking today because I didn't think any of you had, because you had assignment, I figured you probably didn't have time to read. So what I'd like by Wednesday is not to have to do that much talking. Okay, then what I'd like you to take a look at culture. Then I'd like you to just again glance at the second reading, which is the global system of nation states. What we're going to do is we'll summarize that a little bit, and then we're going to start looking at some of the ways those things might clash a little bit. and the kind of thinking you'd have to do to reconcile that collision and make some sense of it as an international studies student. Okay? Anything else? All right. And get some sleep. See what the Kardashians are up to. And I'll talk to you on Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.